It is often remarked that those who fail to learn their history are doomed to repeat it. Today's guests, in their work on Christian women in the patristic world, show that in the case of the diverse and profound ways that women contributed to the shaping of the church, its theology, its practices, its influence, it's more the case that those who fail to learn their history are doomed to suppress it. My name is Liam Miller and welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat. My guests today are Lynn H. Cohick, provost and dean of Denver Seminary in Denver, Colorado. She is the author of Women in the World of the Earliest Christians and commentaries on Philippians and Ephesians. She is also the co-author of the New Testament in Antiquity. The second guest is Amy Brown Hughes, assistant professor of theology at Gordon College in Wenham, Massachusetts. She received her PhD in historical theology with an emphasis in early Christianity from Wheaton College, and she is the co-host of the On Script podcast, which has conversations on current biblical scholarship. Today, we are discussing their book, Christian Women in the Patristic World, Their Influence, Authority, and Legacy in the 2nd through 5th centuries, released by Baker Academic in 2017. Please welcome Lynn and Amy to Love, Rinse, Repeat. Amy, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we're talking about your book, co-authored with Lynn Cohick, who's going to join us in a moment, Christian Women in the Patristic World. What were your hopes going in for the book? And I guess it's been out a couple of years now. How have you found its reception?
You know, when we wrote this book, what we really wanted to see was just an opportunity to tell some stories, sort of at a very basic level of having them being accessible to people, to just take the opportunity to not just have a paragraph on them or sort of a side thing, but to have sort of a chorus of women all in one book, to just really get a sense for just how many women participated in the development of Christianity, and how they all did this in different ways. So we had really hoped to offer a book that was both academically rigorous, but also give people a place to connect with these women from so far long ago and seemingly at a great distance. But from the reception that we've received, it seems it's been very overwhelmingly wonderful. We've been very appreciative of that, and just hearing people say, I had no idea. Some people are saying, I had no idea that women did anything or in early Christianity, because there's just sort of a sense that women were sidelined, and in ways they were, absolutely. But women were participating. They were doing stuff. They were doing theology. They were leading churches. They were doing all sorts of things. And we wanted to make sure to give voice to that. And what we've heard from different readers has been really just very lovely, to be able to participate in a project that people of a variety of backgrounds have read and are giving just saying things like, we're just so happy that this exists. We're just so happy that there's an opportunity to listen to these women, and I had no idea that this existed. It's been great.
That's really excellent. And I think I'm similar in that there was some of the women I might have heard about or were a bit more familiar with, but then there was plenty I was like, wow, did not know that. And we'll unpack some of those more specifics as we go. How did you, I guess, first come interested in this idea, this period? And Lynn's joining us now. Hi, Lynn. Give her a second to get her microphone all set up. I guess the question is, so not only how did you become interested in it as individuals, but then how did you come to work together on the book? How did you come to think this is a good idea for both of our time?
Yeah. So I had done some of my work because I work a little bit later in history than Lynn does, and I was working on a variety for several years, a variety of projects on early Christian ascetic women, like early Christian virgins and that kind of thing. And so a lot of names kept coming up and in my research, and I came across some just interesting texts in doing my master's thesis and in some classes and things. And my dissertation spent a good amount of time with a few of these authors that I interact with in the book. So it was really drawn out of my research, my interest specifically, but then this is where Lynn comes in, getting to participate in her class and talk about my research on asceticism, and then to have the opportunity to expand beyond what I was already doing, and get to know women that I hadn't really spent that much time with. So it was also sort of a personal, it was a very personal project for me too, in the sense of I didn't show up knowing as much as I do know about like Pulcheria, for instance. She'd always been a very interesting figure. Her specifically, I noticed her absence in a lot of the treatments of early Christian Christology. And I thought, how? Cyril writes letters to her. Why isn't she involved in this? So there's just a lot of questions like that were kind of hanging in my research. And this was an opportunity to bring some of those together.
That's great. Well, Lynn, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Thank you.
So how did you, I guess, come to be interested in this area, and what was it like then joining with Amy on the book?
Yeah, I've been interested in this area since I was in graduate school, and I was looking at Julian of Norwich, which is a much later figure, medieval figure, but her faith, as it's expressed in her writing, was just very intriguing to me. She talks about Jesus and motherhood, and it just so happens I was becoming a new mom at that point, and so it was especially poignant to me. And then during my graduate work, I was also very interested in women in the New Testament time. So I mean, I guess I've always been fascinated by that. When Amy and I were both at Wheaton College, that's where we really connected. And I knew that she was working on women in the church a little bit later than where my area of expertise is. I tend to be first, second, maybe a little into the 3rd century, and she's more post-Constantine. But I was doing a class on women in the early church, and she came and spoke and did a just absolutely brilliant job, and thought, hey, this might go somewhere, and turns out it did. It was really fun.
We spent a lot of lunches talking about this, dreaming about it, and it was a really lovely time. I mean, scholarship is often a very solitary experience. And I think it's really important for scholars to at some point work with others on a project like this, not just like contribute to things, but like work with someone else. I thought it was a great experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had great conversations, and I think it helped the focus of the book, I think, to be stronger, because we would ask the kind of questions that continue to draw us back to what are we really focusing on, and then making that a strong.
Well, and you both still seem to be, friendly and willing to at least be in the same online room together. So I'm glad that the process didn't drive too much of a wedge. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Not at all.
So I was thinking the other day, there's the popping up of all these new streaming services these days. Disney Plus, HBO Max, we've got Netflix, we've got Amazon Prime. Now, you've covered a lot of, women or groups of women in this book. These streaming services need content. So if you're walking into the room, which women which woman in this book are you saying needs a 10 parts episode series on a streaming service? Some, good, solid mini-series that's going to delve into their life, their impact on the church and history. Who are you? You can have different ones, that's fine. Who are you pitching to, streaming service of your choice?
Well, I would say for Thecla, she could be in the Marvel comic series because she's got a lot of super human powers. Maybe she'd be Captain Marvel. I don't know. But I think that she certainly, she has a lot of dramatic experiences. I think that we talk about a woman who did pilgrimage, Egeria, and maybe she could be like on Discovery Channel because she goes to a lot of places yeah. So I would say those two off the top of my head.
Right.
Oh, for me, it's definitely those empresses. I could see a 10-part HBO like intensive, dramatic, like one of their like cornerstone pieces, where because those Pulcheria and Eudokia have, because they were contemporaries, right? They were in the same, and the context of the time with all of the, I mean, you have riots, you've got like chariot races later. I mean, you just have all of this like early Byzantium. Like, why isn't a miniseries on this anyway? I don't know. But the drama that happens around the Council of Ephesus is absolutely epic. It deserves a show. Yeah. I've long said that.
Oh, well, I'm sure some streaming services will be listening. That's the bulk of my audience. So let's just throw some money at your way to help develop those. Hopefully, you talk early in the book about the idea of responsible remembering. That comes up a bit, involving advocacy, or a certain sense of advocacy for the historical subjects that you're helping to remember. Can you talk to us a bit about that and what that implies and how that shaped the working on the book?
Sure. So for that phrase comes from Justo Gonzalez's Mañana, a small book, but really excellent book on, I can't remember the subtitle, but it's like a Hispanic theology or something or other. But it's that phrase has stuck with me for a very long time, and as being a way of doing history well. I mean, because this is a project really of historical theology, right? Where we're telling stories, we're also asking theological questions and asking what their contributions were at the time. And I think for our case, when you're talking about women, and you're writing about Christianity and, through Baker Academic, right? Through probably a Christian heavy audience, then you have some questions we have to ask, like, do we sanitize some of these stories in a way that, makes it more palatable to what we kind of hope? Did we really have people that treated them this way or whatnot? Or also just a sense of advocacy for, as I mentioned with Pulcheria, just not really having been part of the conversation. And responsible, remember, there's a responsibility, right, there to recognize who participated in history and what their role is. And there's a lot of, if they're not, sometimes just not included at all, as being peripheral to the Christian story. And I think really core to this book is that you actually can't get away with that. That women were not peripheral to the development of Christianity. And I think we took it as a very serious responsibility to say that history and theology require us to look at this honestly and say, what was the context? What were they up against? What was happening? How did the church respond? What was written about them? How did they understand themselves? All these different things. To look at that honestly, but to actually focus on it and to ask those questions and to give it the space that it needs to have.
I think we also were very conscious of the fact that people are selective sometimes in what they're going to pull from history to prove their point. And I think we wanted to make sure we didn't overinterpret anything. We also recognize that today there are a variety of ways that churches organize themselves. And so we didn't want to enter into a debate on ecclesiology today. We wanted to be descriptive about what was going on in a very, we tried to be in a complete way, so that people would be able to know the full story when they, instead of making claims like, I don't know, there were bishops, female bishops in the ancient world, or there weren't female bishops in the ancient world, or, throwing that around as a way to say what we should do today. I think Amy and I we were very interested in not over-promising, but trying to be thorough.
Thank you for that. You kind of talk it toward the end of the book again, the responsible remembering comes up, and the duty, kind of for, our thinking about representation today. And I guess, how would you encourage churches to practice this responsible remembering? What are ways that churches can kind of engage with the breadth and the depth and the variety in those who have led from there to here?
I wish that at times the churches would look at how women, or what women did, or the questions that women were engaged in, rather than going with their own questions about ordination, for example, kind of picking up on my last point, that if we go with a certain question and we say, oh, they either did this or they didn't do that, we don't really enter into their world, but their world can actually say a lot to us. For example, on issues of poverty and wealth, there was a lot written on that, and women were very engaged in that topic. And so I would encourage churches today to kind of, as they're thinking about those topics, allow the ancients to speak into it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I also think that we used a couple of examples at the end of the book, Marie Wilkinson being one of them, where looking at your own local community, like literally looking at your own body as like that local body, and even perhaps your town or city locale, and going, who are the women that are doing the work now, and how are we listening? Are we seeing it? Is it something that is being recognized? Is it not? And to see that as continuous, right? Because the church is the great cloud of witnesses keeps going. So to see that there are women doing stuff now, and that's part of the continual witness of the church. And so part of it is I absolutely agree with Lynn, like having those historical voices speak into our current realities, but also how our current voices reflect what we see in those ancient realities now.
Great, thank you for that. Some themes that emerge across various chapters in the book, we already talked, like asceticism, virginity, and then, as we were just talking about, maybe the renunciation, or at least the creative use of money. Was this something that you were kind of aware of going in, or was it something that just kind of kept popping up as you were looking at the early sources? And why do you think these ideas and practices played such a prominent role in the women of this world and time?
So I'll be like large and general on this, with thinking about all the sort of trappings of asceticism, with, even if, the women weren't necessarily embracing a full like ascetic lifestyle, but like aspects of it, for instance. But thinking about renunciation of wealth, or of sexuality, marriage, all these different things, there was a pretty significant understanding that in the broad understanding of the word, that Christianity was political. that you and because how you lived in the world mattered, right? And so we see this in even some of the very basic things, like why we get all of these texts that are obsessed with what women are wearing as ascetics. There's just so many of them, and they sound really out of context. They sound really intense and kind of ridiculous, until you realize at the time that in a culture, especially among elite and wealthy women, that it's no different from now. What you wore was who you were. And so there was an understanding that Christianity required something different. When you went into the waters of baptism and you were stripped, you were rubbed with oil to represent the Holy Spirit, and you were given a new robe that didn't distinguish you. Like if you had been wearing purple of one of the upper classes, then that was something that you submitted to the authority of Christ. And so this was, a lot of times I feel like these decisions sound very like, well, women just sort of made these decisions as personal devotional practices, when in reality they were intensely political. Melania the younger is a good example of this, who, you know, the empress comes to her and says, please don't sell everything because you're going to destroy our economy, right? Like, I mean, there's consequences to what they were doing, and they understood, and they went as far as they did because all of the luxurious meats and all of those clothes and the hairstyles and all of that, participating in that meant participating in a political order that was inherently problematic. So in an imperial structure that was really, in so many ways, Christianity was counter-political, right? I'm trying to think of an analogy, but especially close to when the Great Persecution wasn't was still a recent memory. The idea of putting on a T-shirt that says "I heart the Roman Empire," right, is like, which in a lot of ways, participating in sort of the ways the Roman Empire operated. Like that's why asceticism and martyrdom have a lot of continuity there, because there's a really sort of counter-imperial oppression and violence narrative that continues through all of these ascetic pieces. So it makes it even more interesting when you have empresses embracing that exact political identity, but still also being an empress.
Yes, yeah, and I think that connection to martyrdom that asceticism makes is really very important. It's political. There's also a theological piece that I know Amy speaks on quite a bit in her chapters, and what we see in the early martyrs like Thecla, Perpetua, Felicitas, Blandina, those female martyrs are claiming a belief in the resurrection of the body. And so imperial power and political power is also this world power. And when you say that I can lay this body down and Christ will raise it back up, the imperial power really is eviscerated, right? There is no power left. And so I think that was something that the martyrs really promoted, this idea of the resurrection of the body. And the body of a female martyr was as important as the body of a male martyr. So I think that's one of the things the book brings out, is how for a lot of what the women did, the men were also doing. There's not, I mean, you do have certain things that are specific to female expressions of piety. But even in using Amy's example just now with the issue of hairstyles and clothing, yes, it did, and jewelry, certainly pertained to women, but men were also judged by what they wore as well. So while we are talking about women in this book, there's a lot of parallels with just what men were also talking about.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really helpful building out of the world there. A helpful corrective your book provides is that it demonstrates the ways women were also impacting the developing of the dynamic theology of the early church. So kind of, it wasn't just these personal pietistic decisions, it was, you know, an actual like entering into this broader conversation. However, as you observe, this kind of realization is only possible if we free ourselves of kind of the narrow view that theology is only to be found in treatises and creeds. I guess, where did you go looking for theology then, or the way these theological conversations were happening, or this theological input was happening? And what are some of the, I guess, surprising things this revealed about the active role women were playing in the early and key theological movements of the church?
Well, I think one of the things, and Amy will be able to speak to this much more, but I think in terms of the martyrs, I think oftentimes in the post-Constantine church, when you have the celebration of relics and you have the remembrance of the martyrs on their quote unquote birthday when they were martyred, I think there is a sense among scholars at least that somehow that's just superstitious stuff that the regular folk did, but the people who actually wrote the creeds, they were just engaged in all this abstract thought. And in reality, they were as much involved in remembering the martyrs as anybody else. And I think that's an important piece to know, that women were involved in ritual, and men were involved in ritual, and that has a role then in the creeds. But I'll turn it over to Amy, who does a lot more with the creedal part of things.
Yeah, so just using, I mean, we brought up Thecla earlier, right? Like, Thecla is a thread that runs throughout our entire book. I mean, even when you have Gregory of Nazianzus, right, who's Gregory the theologian, spending time at a Thecla shrine. Like, this is, none of these men who are at these councils could escape the contributions of women. Like, it just, they weren't doing this in a vacuum. But yeah, women weren't voting at these things. But at the same time, I don't think that no one shows up to any of these councils and thinks that this is where theology is going to happen primarily. Like, it was mostly where decisions were kind of codified and that kind of thing. There was some discussion, but a lot of times there wasn't. A lot of the theology that was going on was happening. I think it's Gregory of Nyssa in one of his letters talks about how you could go to the marketplace and hear people talking about, homoousios, whether the son was same essence and all this stuff. So there was a sense in which this was not just in churches either, but like these cultural conversations that were happening at the time. And a lot of people were involved in them. And I think that the way theology has been understood is in looking at the early church, there's a sense that we go to, from our modern perspective of theology, we tend to go to things that look familiar to the way we do theology now. So we go to the big books, we go to the this, we go to the that, and those are all fine, but you spend 5 minutes looking at these early Christian theologies and realize that they didn't have that kind of distinction. They were doing theology and biblical commentaries, and not seeing a distinction between a systematic theology versus like a biblical commentary, like no distinction. They were doing theology in letters. They were doing theology Methodius is a good example of theology in a Platonic dialogue. And they were using all of these different kinds of things, because to them, theology wasn't a genre. It was the way the church worked, the way the church engaged with God and with one another. So I think we have to, as readers now, is to recognize our own context with this, and maybe some of the assumptions we bring to previous times in history, and to perhaps see it will offer us a broader view of what the early church has to offer if we don't sort of pigeonhole where theology is done or comes from, because the early church wouldn't agree with our assumptions.
That's very helpful. I put it out to Twitter that I was doing this interview and asked if there were any questions, and one kind of, I guess, builds off this quite well, which was the importance of art in reconstructing or remembering what the role of women is, and there's plenty of art in the book. So you want to speak a bit to that, about what, looking at to art to try to build this remembering.
Well, I think the catacomb chapter, I did a lot of research on that and found that absolutely fascinating. Art is not always easy to interpret. That's one of the wonderful things about art, is it speaks in its own language. And one of the interesting things about the catacomb art is there's so many women figures, including what is called the Oran's figure, which is a pose like this with the arms up, bent at the elbows, palms up towards heaven. And that's a classic pose that we find in pagan art all over the place. We find it also in these Christian catacombs. And the catacombs, by the way, are burial sites. They're not secret. The Romans knew what was going on in there. But they're intriguing because they have these women. And if nothing else, what the artwork shows is how involved women were in the expression of Christianity at those most poignant times, i.e. in death. And then secondly, it shows how important certain Bible stories were to the whole community. And some of those Bible stories included women as central figures. Like, for example, Susanna, which is a character that's part of the Daniel story. And so there's what that should signal to us is that that women played an active role in how Christianity looked in the early centuries before it became a licit religion, with Constantine. It looked like you had women and men very much participating around meals and caring for the community, even those that had passed, and also thinking about it through the stories in the Bible.
I also think we have some more throughout the book. You note that we have several different pieces, right? And the cover comes from a church in Arezzo that is an entire fresco cycle about the true cross, and you have Helena on the front there. I just happened to be back there and to see this and think, yeah, this would look good on the cover of a book. But we include a few other ones, like images of Monica and Augustine and such. And I think it's important to see that women are marginalized in various ways, but there's also the constant, and has been sort of throughout history, this constant representation of women as being part of these conversations, as being influential in these people's lives, as being there, and it's a continual reminder that, using the Monica and Augustine example, for instance, that with such a towering figure like Augustine, to have this woman who's such a, being his mother, of course, being a major part of his life, but how he perceived her, and we can read the confessions and the early dialogues that we look at in the book, the Cassiciacum dialogues, and then also see Renaissance art and all sorts of things, and see how Christians throughout history and artists who were patronized by other people, right, especially during the Renaissance, that continue to receive the importance of these relationships, the importance of in some of these major figures' lives. So we just wanted to show that the church hasn't really been ignoring them as much as maybe sometimes we might perceive. Maybe our particular tradition doesn't highlight women's contributions as much, but that women have, they were there, and people know that they were.
Yeah, thank you for that. You were mentioning then Monica and Macrina are maybe two of the more well-known women in the book, depending on your tradition and what you've read. But kind of thanks to, say, the prominence of their male family members who wrote about them. What's it like trying to, I guess, approach these historical subjects through the writings of a singular male family member? And I guess, was there anything you found that either united Augustine's and Gregory's intentions of preserving the memory of these influential family members?
I think both Monica and Macrina, the reason we put them together is because both of them were not only just family members, but family members that were cherished. You can't read the life of Macrina or the Confessions without coming away with a real sense that their brother and son respectively could have lived without them in a way. Like, they're just very warm texts, right? And there's a real sense of closeness and of care. And so, but there are questions of, well, can you get to, scholars have had various questions about, can you get to the real Macrina or to the real Monica? And I would sort of open that up to pretty much any historical figure. Even if we have direct writings of them, can we get to the real Augustine? I mean, how many thousands upon thousands of books will be written before we realize, no, we can't, because we will always be at a distance. We'll always have that. And so the Monica we have, the Macrina we have are who we know through these men who sort of preserve their memories in posterity. And that's not, I mean, that's what we have. So we can't like pretend that it's not that. But we can look at because it's their remembrance of these women, it's their life of Macrina, it's their story about them in the confessions that becomes constitutive for how people know who Monica and Macrina are. So in a very real way, the only Monica we've ever known is Augustine's Monica. The only Macrina we've ever known is Gregory's Monica or Macrina. So there's a sense in which we do need, that's where that responsible remembrance comes in and says, you know, there is a sense of distance here. And there are some interesting questions we do need to ask. Like what, when we look at On the Soul and the Resurrection, like this doesn't read like a transcript. So what is Gregory doing here, right? And there's some ways that we can get at that, which we do in the book, but without sort of pretending that Gregory's like not writing this from his perspective about his sister, right? We can be honest about that, but that still matters. Like their legacy is still theirs, even if it's mediated.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess toward the end of the book, you talk about the way power was understood and explored by many of these patristic women, maybe a power in weakness or a power in humility grounded in the imitation of Christ. You mentioned at one point an authority used to bless neighbors. Can you explore this for us a little? And I guess either potential or potential risks in trying to learn from that and maybe model ourselves after that today.
Well, I want to bring in Lynn here in a second because Blandina is a good is a good place to have that person to have that conversation with too. But I think there's a real risk that when you're talking about like be like these women who like power being manifest in weakness, then that means that people who are already marginalized, who are already oppressed, would have to be perhaps marginalized or be more humble than they already are. And I would just point to how core to pretty much every woman that we look at in the book, not all of them, the core that Christ is to them and Christological imitation. And a real sense of what it meant for Christ to suffer, and the strong identification and not in a sense of I'm like Christ, but like actual embodied participation, like living into Christ's sufferings, like taking that extremely seriously, but recognizing that at the same time that is a place of agency. And whether that turns out to be agency from like a historical perspective is another question, but they understood it that way. And to see that they weren't seeing that as a place where God is wanting them to heap on themselves even more suffering in the sense of like letting people destroy them. In fact, as Lynn mentioned about the sort of resurrection, like the imperial power doesn't have, it's a different kind of understanding of what power is. And so Christologically, these women really had kind of this, and men too had this idea that Christ suffered, and then their suffering is connected to Christ's suffering, that they're not, first of all, not doing this on their own, but with others and with Christ, and that this isn't a place where they're having to become less than who they want to be. Now you might quibble with that theological articulation, right? But that's how they were understanding it. That they were seeing Christ with them in that place.
Yes, there's a phrase just occurred to me, a biblical phrase. It's not in the book, but when John the Baptist informs his disciples that Christ must become greater and he must become less. That is, John the Baptist becomes less. And I think that certainly frames the goals of so many of the saints in the period that we were studying, both men and women, that you want to become more like Christ. And so you look at the habits of Christ, and obviously they're going to do it through their lens, but certainly moderation, even asceticism, was a goal that they also saw in Christ's life. So I think the putting Christ first was a theological conviction. It was not a pseudo humbling personal kind of approach that was forced on women. It was something that women and men held as a conviction. Where I think that the gender piece can be seen is in, for example, Blandina. She is a slave woman who ends up being the leader of a group of martyrs. And as the story unfolds, she's one of the last standing, so to speak, last alive. And in one particular poignant scene, she's hung up on a stake, on a cross like device, and the others who are around her look to her, and what they see is not Blandina, they see Christ. It's a very powerful point of the story. And so in that in that case, the woman is not disappearing in some kind of negative way. At least that's not how the Christians would see it. She's actually representing the one they love the most. That would be the same with the martyr Perpetua. She ends up being the leader of the group of martyrs, and they all look to her, and she takes up the responsibility of leadership. I think perhaps because she comes from a more wealthy family, is probably a little bit more educated, and then just used to making decisions or other people looking to her as though she should be in charge. She also has some visions, and that solidifies her authority. But I think both Amy and I were trying to get at the idea that these women often had responsibilities and authority because of their testimony, and that they had this very important role to play in the church, irrespective of whether they had a title like empress. That they actually just excited the imagination of Christians because they stood for the ideals of the Christian faith.
Well, thank you for that. So we're coming to an end. I like to play a little game as we come to the end called pairings. You know, if you've been in a restaurant before, there's often a pairing of a wine with a meal. So the way we do it here is you have to take your book and pair it with a meal, a good meal that would be, could be eaten alongside reading of the book, a piece of music like a song or an album or something like that, and another book. So once you've read Christian Women in the Patristic World, you're like, oh, I want more. I want something that bounces off these ideas. What should they take off their shelf or put in their online book cart after that? So I'll turn over to you guys to have a crack at that.
Oh my goodness!
Well, wow. I can say the song.
You got a song?
song? What's the song?
I think I got a song, and it might be a little silly, but it's the one that immediately came to, well, not silly song, but it immediately came to my head was Girls Run the World by Beyonce. Right? Like, I feel like every single chapter is like, it's women, like, Blandine is a good example of that. Like, I'm a slave, but I'm going to be Christ here in this moment. Like, I'm going to run this.
Yeah, and your question about a meal, boy, I don't know. I almost feel like we should say a buffet, because, you know, what are you going to eat as you read a martyrdom account? Compared to reading something of someone on a journey versus then I don't know. That's where I think probably a buffet. It would probably be the best.
I go with that, but like a good buffet, not like
not a cheap one. No, I'm thinking of like an Easter buffet. How's that? Resurrection.
I like it. An Easter buffet.
There you go.
All right.
At a nice restaurant.
And then you asked another book to read.
So like something that would complement the book well.
I was going to say.
I've got one.
You have one each.
Okay.
No, I was just thinking that we tried to develop the church from a particular angle. Eusebius's ecclesiastical history would give audiences a slightly different angle on some of the same things that we talked about.
Yeah, so an ancient book. And I was actually thinking of Kate Wilkinson's Women in Modesty in Early Christianity.
Yep.
Great. I mean, we use her book in ours, but it's just a great piece that I think goes really nicely with the subject matter that we have. But I also would say reading something like a significant work on Christology would be a good fit with this. Perhaps something as intense as The Crucified God by Jürgen Moltmann. Something that is like a really intensive perspective on Christology. Or even something like James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree. It really sort of sees that piece of the sort of marginalized, the suffering of society, because I think that's a place where the martyrs would be interested in that conversation.
I think both Amy and I would really hope that people would be excited to read the primary sources that we drew from. And that would be my real hope, is that someone would read Perpetua's Martyrdom. It's not that hard. You can just Google it, right? Or read Thecla, the Acts of Paul and Thecla. That I think that a lot of them are accessible, and that they're just fun. I think they're just fun. There you could pull up a nice cup of coffee.
Well, lovely. Well, we've got people's next 6 months of reading covered now.
There you go.
It's exciting. Right. The book, everyone, is Christian Women in the Patristic World, Their Influence, Authority and Legacy in the 2nd through 5th centuries. Available now through Baker Academic. Check it out, buy it, do the 5-star review thing on Amazon, because that helps, so please go on and do it. Lynn and Amy, thank you for coming on. Is there anything else you'd like to promote? Any other ways people can connect, or anything else you want to shout out at this moment?
No, I just really appreciate that you sought us out. We certainly love talking about our favorite subject. So.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I'm just excited to be able to continue offering a resource in the world that people can read and learn about these women. It's exciting.
Yeah, and you can still buy it now for Christmas. It's a great Christmas present for your friends and family out there. So, get onto that and buy yourself one, because you deserve it. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.